Okay, good morning and good afternoon, everybody. Welcome again to the Washington Policy Pulse. I'm going to lean forward to try and get my camera to zoom in and make me a little bit clear. But we want to say thank you very much for attending today and taking the precious time out of January 21st to listen to us talk about what we think is going on in Washington. We have a new president. President-elect Donald Trump is now President Donald Trump. He has taken the oath of office. He is now over at the White House. I can confirm that he is busy because he just left. His motorcade just left a few minutes ago. But yesterday we saw a lot of executive orders coming from the White House and Capital One Arena and the Capitol and so forth like that. So I wanted to take today's call to talk about what we anticipate or what we are seeing coming from that. So if you've attended this call before, you know that you've heard this broken record before. I'm not going to get into it, but again, there's three ways of doing business: executive orders, regulations, and legislation. And yesterday, President Trump designed what he called as a shock and awe campaign on executive orders. Now, I would argue it was more awe than shock. I don't think there was much anything surprising in these executive orders. When I closed my laptop last night and went to bed, there really wasn't anything here that I didn't think was all that out surprising, but certainly things that we need to talk about nevertheless. Just as a reminder, though, executive orders, many of them are symbolic. Presidents only have authority over the executive branch. They don't have authority over the legislative or the judicial branch. A lot of this is going to go to the courts. President Trump's, we've already seen a lawsuit over President Trump's executive order over the Doge Committee, if you will. We're also going to see anticipated lawsuits over President Trump's executive order to narrow birthright citizenship. But again, those are going to be the courts. It's outside of the executive branch. And power of the presidency is more powerful when it comes to trade, national security, tariffs, like Holly's going to talk about, and the energy sector. We saw a lot of executive orders, so Rob's going to talk about that. So there were two main buckets of executive orders that we felt really didn't have much of a company impact, but it's certainly important to talk about. First was immigration. Now, this is President Trump, I want to call it, probably his number one priority at the moment. In fact, just yesterday he said, he made a statement that even though when compared to inflation and the prices, that he felt that his mandate, his election win, if you will, was due to the U.S. border, and that these immigration policies are certainly going to be one of his top priorities. And, these are things that he can largely do. Just as a reminder, if it's a budgetary aspect of immigration policy, meaning you need more dollars to pay for this policy, that comes from Congress. If it's a change in policy, like turning off the CBP1 app, which happened just after 12 o'clock yesterday, that's something that the president can largely control. Now, we're not doing a ton of work on immigration, but I do want to take this moment that if you ever want to learn about what our friends over at Bloomberg Economics are doing in terms of what the macro level economic impact is of taking out 10 to 14 million individuals from the U.S. Economy, they're doing a lot of work, great work over there, and I can certainly push that to you as well. And the second is the reorganization of the federal government. These executive orders really don't have much of an investing angle, but certainly important nevertheless. A couple that I wanted to point out too, just in terms of returning folks back to the office and so forth. But there were two that I think a lot of people have questions on. First was this idea of the Doge Committee. Now, what President Trump did in his executive order last night is he actually renamed the United States Digital Service, which is an office located in the White House that has to deal with enhancing. It was actually created back during the internet age to try and enhance the internet. But this office, which has about 150 people working for it, was renamed the United States Doge Service. Now, within that, the executive order is creating a temporary Doge office within that, and that is where Elon Musk and his team are going to be working. Now, the thought here is, from what we heard from Bloomberg News, is that Doge is going to get around 20 offices over in the White House, meaning some were probably not the White House proper, but the old executive office building or the new executive office building. Elon Musk was spotted walking into there yesterday. But, again, think of them as a think tank for the U.S. government. Vivek Ramaswamy, for what it's worth, has left the Doge Committee. He is now going to run for Ohio's governor. But the work over, the next few weeks and months that we're going to see is more geared towards trying to provide a legislative blueprint for Republicans on how to cut the government. The Doge, if you will, isn't going to be able to do anything other than advise the president of how to work with the executive branch. But again, remember, the funding and the structure and so forth comes from Congress, so you can't cut funds, you can't cut things from the budget unless Congress signs off for it. But if you have a think tank that says, here, we want to cut X billion from the budget, and we're going to write the legislation for you. If you're a Republican lawmaker over on the Hill, that's something that you're going to like in either way. The other thing that I want to talk about is the External Revenue Service. Now, President Trump announced this in his speech that he was going to create this External Revenue Service to deal with all of the money that is coming in from tariffs. Now, this wasn't created in any of the executive orders that he said yesterday, but he directed the Treasury, the Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of Commerce, and the Secretary of Homeland Security to study the issue. What I think will happen with the External Revenue Service is they'll create a task force within these agencies. They'll call it the External Revenue Service, and then as a branding exercise, they will then begin to highlight the tariff collections that are coming in for what it's worth. However, there are other buckets of executive orders that we think could have more significant impact, and tariffs is probably the number one. Holly, can I turn it over to you? Can you just give us your thoughts on what happened yesterday?
Sure. So what happened yesterday was a little different than what we expected him to do based on his pledge on the campaign trail, although he's changed his mind before. So on the campaign trail, he had pledged tariffs as high as 60% on goods from China and 10 to 20% everywhere else. And he had sort of said like that he would impose tariffs on day one, but instead of doing that, it looks like he's going to be more circumspect. He issued this memo where he tasked various agencies with investigating certain practices, like whether countries are honoring trade agreements, currency depreciation, trade deficits, and things of that nature, which to me mean that it's probably going to take more time. He did say that there are certain crises that he wants to address, and those could be addressed through proclamation. And if he does that, like if, for example, he said there was some kind of emergency, he could use a statute to declare an emergency, and then tariffs could take effect immediately. But it's not clear he intends to do that either. There was some conversation that he would impose tariffs of on Mexico and Canada on February 1st. And if he does do that, we think there are various statutes he may seek to use. One of the things he mentioned in the memo was that, he wants to see if the Canada and Mexico are honoring prior trade agreement. And if he finds his agency, which is the U.S. Trade Rep, if that agency finds that there's they're not honoring trade agreements, then he could use a statute called Section 301 of the Trade Act, which he's used before for similar reasons against China, where he said there were similar reasons, and that could be used to impose sweeping tariffs. So it could be, and because when he used that section before, he used it on China to address so-called violations of intellectual property, and there were a massive amount of tariffs imposed on like over $300 billion worth of Chinese goods. So we think he may seek to use that section again. But the bottom line is we think that there are lots of statutes that give him authority to do this. And, the challenges so far in court have been pretty unsuccessful.
Great. And Holly, you just put out a note about an hour ago, and can you talk about some of the impacts of the companies? What were some of the industries that you were calling out that could be more exposed to these idea of the tariffs than not?
Well, we still think that there will be tariffs imposed, even though he's more circumspect. He may be more circumspect, and we think they will be imposed on goods from China. So companies that make goods in China, like apparel companies and EV companies, could be impacted. And it's possible also that apparel companies that make goods in Vietnam could be impacted if he imposes tariffs there as well.
Great, thank you. And if anybody wants a copy of that note, please reach out to Holly or I. We can get that to you. And we're actually updating. What we're doing right now is we're updating our sector by sector notes. So I put financials out this morning. Tariffs is going out. Healthcare, you name it. We have each sector. But I think this is a good way to talk about energy because yesterday, out of all the sectors that we cover, energy was the one that we saw the most executive orders on. And so I've asked Rob to come in to talk about those executive orders, what he's seeing in that space, because even in the speech, President Trump said, drill, baby, drill. And so, Rob, I ask you, are we back in an era of drill, baby, drill again?
Well, I don't think we've exited drill, baby, drill. We've been doing it for a couple of decades now, and uh, we, the executive order doesn't really change the paradigm very much. That the U.S. is producing record volumes on oil and gas, and our general sense is that the industry will continue to do that, and that's really not subject to any of these new executive orders. My colleague Vince Piazza has a good note that I think frames our thinking on this topic quite well, and it says the title of it, and I'm happy to share it with the group, but it's "Forget Elections, Politics Don't Affect Energy in the Long Run." And so we've seen, great emergence of technology, shale oil and gas drilling, which has really been the key factor that's helped boost production in the U.S. But a lot of the E&Ps that are very active here are focused on shareholder returns, capital discipline, these kinds of things. So even if you say, hey, you're allowed to drill more, they might look at you and say, well, that's great, and maybe we'll eventually do it, but it's not something that they're hyper-focused on here at the moment. Maybe a couple of other things to mention, though, because I do think there were some interesting nuggets within the sort of energy executive order landscape. One of them is that, as was telegraphed, President Trump put a halt to offshore wind leasing. We anticipated this, and I think the thing to keep in mind there is that one, the U.S. is really a minor player in the whole offshore wind narrative. We don't have hardly any offshore wind capacity up and running. We're certainly very far behind Europe or China on that front. And perhaps hitting pause gives other countries the opportunity to prove the technology, and maybe the U.S. will take a look a little bit further down the road. I think the executive order does mention a little bit about revisiting the existing leases, but I think any of that will be subject to legal challenge. And my sense is if you've already got a lease and you're in process on a project, I'd be quite surprised if that were to be affected. Never say never, but certainly something to keep an eye on because there is some language around that. And then I think probably the thing that I would highlight most just within the energy piece of the executive order landscape, because there, as you mentioned, Nathan, there were a number of orders, is just that there's this idea in one of the orders about repealing or scaling back the NEPA permitting requirements. And this could potentially have a relatively big impact on power plants, pipelines, things like that. And so that's a piece I'm really keeping an eye on because generally speaking, permitting delays are a big part of building any big piece of energy infrastructure. So if that process is streamlined, walked back, scaled back, made easier, that'll be really interesting. I suspect all of this stuff will be quite litigated, though, so I think it will be some time before we have clarity on exactly what's happening there.
Yeah, I mean, you hit it on the head when it said clarity because, we're anticipating another round of executive orders coming out today. What I'm looking for is cryptocurrency. We never saw a crypto order yesterday. like we thought we would. A lot of folks on Twitter, sorry, X at the moment, are calling for that. And then President Trump has said that there's going to be an infrastructure announcement, a massive infrastructure announcement at 4 p.m. Eastern today. We'll see what that is about. I actually haven't heard anything in terms of infrastructure within these potential executive orders, so certainly be interesting to speak. Now that the executive orders are coming and going, I will say this is where we're going to end the Washington period of you have a president that wants to move extremely fast, and he's going to run into a bureaucracy in which it doesn't move fast, whether it's regulation, deregulation, or Congress or anything like that. You're going to see this process really slow down. Over the next few weeks, we're continuing to see confirmation hearings. Senator Marco Rubio just took his oath of the office this morning. We're going to see a flurry of other hearings this week, like Elise Stefanik to be the UN. Scott Bessent, I'm guessing, will be confirmed this week. Had a client reach out and ask if it was going to be before the February Treasury issuances. We think it will be. And then, then the work on tax extensions has to be done. Because if you've been to this call before, you know that we've talked about to keep the Trump era tax cuts going at the end of 2025, you're going to have to pay, or at least get close to, the idea of extending these tax cuts for $4.5 trillion. And the House Ways and Means Committee, and if you need a copy of this, I can send it to you. The House Ways and Means Committee put out a 2-pager last week talking about all the potential areas that could be cut. And what our message to the clients at the time was, look, this is just areas that could be cut. There's really no agreement yet on where this should focus. I mean, Rob and I talk about the Inflation Reduction Act a lot. That has come up in the discussions. The SALT deduction, for those of you living in New York and New Jersey, you know that the Salty Caucus, if you will, met with Mar-a-Lago last week to try and increase the cap from 10,000 to whatever. For what it's worth, President Trump seems to be floating this idea of a 20,000 cap. The Salty Caucus, if you will, wants 100,000. But where we're going with this is that this is where the soap opera portion of the cabinet begins. This is where they're going to have to try and figure out how to get their plans through without only losing 5 votes. So stay with us. It's going to be an extremely long year. I'm going to pause here in case there are any other questions. But if not, thank you very much for attending. And we certainly will get you any information that you want. And we'll have this call again on Monday next week. So I'll pause there and say thank you very much. Have a great day.